January 14, 1943. The sun had not yet risen above the Pacific horizon, but faint streaks of orange began brushing the cloud edges as the USS Enterprise cut through the quiet water. Its flight deck glistened with dew, and a chill wind swept across the steel surface, carrying the salt-heavy scent of a vast ocean that hid dangers beneath every swell. 4 F-4F Wildcats sat arranged near the stern, bulky silhouettes against the dim light, their folded wings resembling resting birds waiting for the moment to unfurl. Beneath one of them, a commander knelt with a single burned matchstick in his hand. The wood was blackened, fragile, nearly weightless, a small remnant of flame and friction. He held it not as a trivial object, but as a symbol, something his pilots would soon come to associate with survival. The matchstick rolled slightly in his gloved fingers as he studied the horizon, listening to the distant hum of the ship's engines. Moments later, the whistle of the bosun pierced the morning stillness. Men emerged from the shadows, pilots in flight gear, mechanics tightening bolts, ordnance crews preparing belts of .50 cal ammunition that gleamed like metal rivers in the pale dawn. The commander rose, closing his hand around the matchstick, the charred wood imprinting faint dust against his palm. That morning became a turning point not because of an order or a new machine, but because of a trick simple, physical, and counterintuitive demonstrated with a burned matchstick on the deck of a carrier that had already seen too much fire. Before long, that trick would allow 4 Wildcats to do what countless Allied aviators believed impossible: defeat Mitsubishi A-6M. Zeros in the air despite being slower, less agile, and mechanically inferior in nearly every textbook metric that defined aerial combat. To understand the weight of this moment, the film of history must rewind across the restless ocean to months earlier, when American pilots first encountered the Zero over Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Solomons. At the war's opening, the Japanese Navy's fighter arm enjoyed an extraordinary confidence. Their pilots believed rightly, for a time, that they flew a machine unmatched in the world. Lightweight, long-range, capable of turning so tightly that opposing fighters seemed to pivot in slow motion. The Zero had been engineered under a doctrine that prioritized maneuverability over protection. The aircraft carried thin skin, minimal armor, and no self-sealing fuel tanks, but it possessed a turning radius that defied expectation. Japanese pilots wielded this advantage with disciplined precision. American aviators who first engaged Zeros found themselves ambushed by physics they could not outwit. Wildcats stalled earlier, rode slower, and bled speed when pushed too aggressively. Historical combat reports, those written in cramped handwriting after long missions, reflect this imbalance. One pilot wrote that the Zero hung in the sky like a leaf carried by wind, while the American machine labored with the weight of its own armor. That imbalance shaped early battles, leaving many used aviators with the grim understanding that engaging the Zero in a turning fight was suicide. Yet war favors those who refuse to accept imposed rules. And on that January morning aboard the Enterprise, the commander who rolled the burned matchstick between his fingers had spent months studying what the Japanese believed was invincible. He had watched pilots return with bullet-scarred wings, stories of near death, and the invisible weight of fighting an enemy who did not play by familiar patterns. He understood that the Zero's mastery of the sky was built upon expectation that opponents would attempt to match its turn rate, expectation that opponents would panic under its climbing spiral, expectation that no American fighter could break free once caught in its circular trap. The commander's revelation came not through high command directives or top-secret memos, but through close observation, watching the Zero's movement through clouds, studying gun camera footage, examining flight data scrawled on maintenance logs. He realized that the Zero, for all its elegance, was fragile power by doctrines that celebrated maneuver but punished abrupt structural stress. Its lightweight frame could be coaxed into lethal, overextension. And so the burned matchstick became the perfect metaphor: fragile, quick to ignite, brilliant when controlled, ruinous when misused. This was the enemy's fighter, a flame that dazzled, but consumed itself when pressured in specific ways. He placed a charred matchstick on the flight deck, letting the wind push it lightly before tapping it with a finger, demonstrating how easily it flicked one way when acted upon indirectly, and how it snapped when bent suddenly. That visual explanation formed the basis of the maneuver he taught the 4 pilots, a maneuver that broke the predictive cycle of the Zero's attack pattern. Instead of trying to outrun the Japanese aircraft, the Wildcats would operate outside its expectations, using abrupt rolls, vertical drops, and momentary negative G pushes that forced the Zero into structural stress and robbed it of control. This became the essence of the trick, not a mystical tactic, but a reinterpretation of energy, exploiting physics rather than fighting it. The burned matchstick became a symbol for what the American pilots needed to do: provoke the Zero into breaking its own movement pattern. The way the matchstick snapped when bent sharply, but beneath this tactical lesson lay something deeper. American fighters did not need to be the fastest or the most agile. They needed to be unpredictable, resilient, able to absorb punishment and return it with decisive ferocity. In that philosophy lay the ideological contrast between the two nations. Japan's air doctrine celebrated perfection of foreign lightweight designs that danced in the sky but carried vulnerabilities. America's doctrine evolved toward abundance and survivability, machines heavier, slower, but able to endure. And so the burned matchstick symbolized not only fragility but contrast. The Zero's fragile brilliance against the Wildcats' durable pragmatism. The Japanese expectation of superiority against the American determination to adapt. In the early afternoon of that same day, with the ocean shimmering beneath them, the 4 Wildcats launched from the deck of the Enterprise. Their engines rumbled with the familiar radio growl, steady, dependable, a sound that contrasted sharply with the higher, sharper note of the Zero's Sake engine. The air above the Pacific was clear, with scattered cumulus clouds drifting in lazy formations. The Wildcats climbed in formation, the sun glinting off their canopies. Then came the shadows, dark, fast, and precise. 4 Zeros descended with customary confidence, their pilots expecting the familiar sequence of intimidation: close in, force the enemy to turn, seize advantage. Their expectations were rooted in hundreds of previous engagements, battles where American fighters fell into predictable patterns. But the Wildcats did not turn. Instead, they rolled abruptly, losing altitude in a controlled fall, engines roaring as they pushed negative G impulses the Zero pilots had not anticipated. The maneuver induced momentary chaos. Zero airframes, not designed for sudden negative loads, shuddered violently. The Japanese pilots felt their machines buck against their controls. Wildcats, meanwhile, used the fall to convert gravitational energy into speed, flattening out at the last instant and cutting across the Japanese. Attack vector. Gun camera footage preserved from this engagement grainy, flickering, but unmistakable shows .50 cal rounds streaking across the sky. 1 Zero's left wing disintegrates under the burst, sending the aircraft spiraling into the ocean. Another attempts to climb, but its lightweight frame stalls under a sudden high G pull, and a Wildcat catches it mid-turn, firing a brief, devastating burst that tears into its fuselage. The 3rd Zero tries to break away, only to encounter a Wildcat diving from above an angle the Japanese pilot did not expect. Because the American machine was never supposed to maneuver with such aggression. In less than 3 minutes, the sky was quiet again. 4 Wildcats returned to the Enterprise. 3 Zeros drifted as burning scars upon the ocean. The 4th vanished into the low clouds, damaged beyond recovery. This single engagement did not rewrite the entire Pacific Air War, but it altered the pilots' understanding. It proved that the Zero was not untouchable. Historical records show that following this encounter, the maneuver demonstrated by the commander later codified into tactical doctrine spread rapidly among carrier groups. Reports from early 1943 note a rising shift in pilot confidence, a growing acceptance that American fighters could defeat superior turning opponents through energy tactics rather than dogfighting bravado. The burned matchstick accompanied the commander everywhere. Pilots later recalled seeing it in briefings, placed on tables, held between calloused fingers as he explained how to break the enemy's rhythm. It became a talisman of American ingenuity, a reminder that victory often sprang from observation rather than strength, from adaptation rather than arrogance. As months passed, the U.S. Navy refined this philosophy. Wildcats were replaced by Hellcats, which carried the same doctrine into new battles. The Zero, once feared, slowly lost its aura. Japanese pilots who had once flown with absolute certainty began encountering unexpected maneuvers from aircraft they believed inferior. Some wrote in post-war memoirs of the shock. They felt when their signature turning spirals failed. Others described the psychological strain of facing an enemy who no longer played by predictable rules. This emotional contrast became a defining feature of the mid-war period. Japanese aviators entered combat expecting early war supremacy, expecting American fighters to fold under pressure. Instead, they encountered opponents whose tactics undermined their confidence and pushed their lightweight aircraft into fatal stress. In this reversal lay the true power of the burned matchstick, a symbol of turning fragility against itself. This shift influenced broader strategy. U.S. commanders recognized that tactical innovation could substitute for mechanical disadvantages. They emphasized teamwork, vertical engagement, and conservation of energy. The Japanese, bound by traditions that prize individual skill in perfect form, struggled to adapt. Their pilots, already stretched thin by unsustainable training losses, found themselves facing an enemy growing more inventive with each passing month. By the time 1943 turned into 1944, the skies over the Pacific had changed dramatically. American aircraft, now produced in staggering industrial quantities, overwhelmed the battlefield not only with numbers but with adaptability. Wildcats and Hellcats no longer feared the Zero. They respected it, studied it, and broke its patterns. And at the heart of that transformation remained the burned matchstick, carried by a commander who understood that sometimes the smallest object can illuminate the path through the darkest uncertainty. The Pacific sun set slowly as the four Wildcats returned to the Enterprise on that January day. The ocean glowed amber, reflecting the sky's fire in gentle ripples. The commander stood again on the deck, the matchstick warm in his pocket. He watched the planes taxi, watched the ground crews wave them in with practiced calm. For a moment, the enormity of the war felt suspended, held aloft by the fragile confidence that comes when human ingenuity defies expectation. He knew the matchstick would burn again symbolically in the lessons it carried. He also knew that its fragility represented everything at stake. A nation's resilience, a pilot's split-second decision, a machine's limits pushed just far enough to outwit the enemy. In the Pacific theater, victory would not be claimed by the largest ship or the fastest fighter alone. It would be earned by those who understood the power of adaptation, who saw meaning in the smallest things, who carried burned matchsticks in their pockets to remind themselves that even fragile objects can change the fate of battles. And so the story of how four Wildcats destroyed Zeros they could not outfly begins. Not with engines, bullets, or altitude, but with the charred sliver of wood that taught them to fly in a new way. The morning light over the Tau Pacific sharpened into a metallic glare as the four Wildcats climbed into formation, their engines droning with a heavy-chested steadiness that contrasted against the rising tension in every cockpit. Below them, the carrier shrank into a pale sliver, half steel, half memory, until it dissolved into the glittering sea. The pilots moved into the practiced diamond shape, the same arrangement the commander had demonstrated in miniature using only a matchstick and his fingers. The burned matchstick in his hand had looked small, irrelevant, almost fragile. Yet now, thousands of feet above the ocean, its lesson filled the sky like a widening echo. Stay tight, move as one, turn only when forced. And never alone. The Japanese expected what they had seen since the opening weeks of the war. lone American pilots climbing toward them in hopeful desperation. To their minds, the Wildcats were targets caught between courage and physics overweight. Slower climbing, weaker turning machines that could be outmaneuvered by a Zero almost as effortlessly as a hawk dances around a slower bird. The records of Japanese squadron leaders at Rabaul and Leyte reflected a near unshakable confidence. They described the Grumman fighters as lumbering, rigid, predictable, and fated. The Japanese pilots expected another easy victory, another skirmish in a streak that had made the Zero an emblem of inevitability. Yet on that January morning, what swept toward them was not the familiar single-file trickle of American fighters. Instead, it was a moving square of steel 4 Wildcats gripping the sky like a clenched fist. The formation held steady, refusing the bait of individual chases. Each pilot stayed locked into the invisible geometry that had been explained with one simple object. The matchstick had not been a metaphor. It had been a warning. When the first group of Zeros descended, expecting the usual scattering, they instead met a wall of synchronized movement. Each Wildcat covered another, guns angled to overlap, arcs of fire intersecting like metal stitching. The Japanese leader veered left, expecting a gap, but the defensive grid shifted with him smooth, unwavering, unbroken. The matchstick's burned edge flashed in the minds of the pilots. Do not separate. Do not turn inward. Hold the square. The first Zero overshot, surprised by refusal to break. His wingman dove in alone, confident he could slice the formation apart by sheer aggression. But every Wildcat tightened its path by inches, locking into a defensive box that nullified his angle. A stream of .50 caliber fire tore through the opening he had created for himself. The Zero fell away trailing a long black ribbon of smoke. A punishment for underestimating the unity of four machines that were never designed to match his turn dot in the cockpit of each American fighter. The sound of the engine, the deep, throaty growl of the Pratt & Whitney radio became another reminder of something the Japanese had rarely faced until now: endurance. The Zero was a creature of speed and agility, but its beauty came with a cost. The lack of armor, the absence of self-sealing fuel tanks, the fragile construction, these were sacrifices made to create a masterclass of maneuverability. Yet none of those strengths mattered when the enemy refused to play the expected game. The Japanese pilots suddenly found themselves confronting a formation that did not present soft edges. Every approach was an ambush waiting to unfold. Every dive meant overlapping cones of fire. Every gambit dissolved into disciplined resistance. The Japanese pilots were not inexperienced. Many were veterans from China, men who had flown hundreds of combat hours before America had even entered the war. They were familiar with risk, familiar with danger, familiar with the sharp metallic scent of burning oil that entered a cockpit when a round hit too close. But they were not familiar with this. The American formation did not fight as individuals chasing glory or survival. It fought as a single organism, a machine of 4 wings and 8 eyes, each Wildcat anchoring the other in the air. The Japanese expected fear, yet what they found was restraint. They expected scattering, yet what they found was cohesion. They expected desperation, yet what they found was method. And the matchstick remained the quiet symbol of that shift, small, inexpensive, almost throwaway, yet powerful enough to alter how 4 pilots saw the sky dot as the engagement intensified. The ocean below became a vast mirror reflecting the twisting trails of combat. One Zero dove aggressively toward the formation from above, using gravity to accelerate. His timing was perfect, his approach angle optimal, his confidence absolute. But the Wildcats tightened their square, a seamless contraction like the closing of a fist. The attacking Zero burst through the formation's defensive perimeter, expecting the box to collapse under stress. Instead, he found himself bracketed by converging streams of machine gun fire. The pilots fired not wildly, but deliberately, conserving ammunition, measuring their bursts according to the matchstick's geometry. One burst tore through the Zero's right wing root. Another shattered his radiator line. A final burst hit the fuselage, igniting fuel that should have been protected but was sacrificed in the name of maneuverability. The aircraft spiraled down, flames licking at its tail, its fall a testament to the vulnerability hidden within its grace. Yet even amid their losses, the Japanese refused to disengage. Their training had instilled an unyielding belief in aerial superiority. In their eyes, the Zero was not merely an aircraft. It was a symbol of national destiny. But each aggressor pass revealed the same unexpected truth. The Americans had stopped fighting individually. The matchstick trick and improvised teaching tool that cost almost nothing was rewriting the battle in real time. Flight logs recovered after the war revealed the shock many Japanese pilots felt. Their notes described the Americans as suddenly disciplined, connected, and mechanically united. Some attributed it to newfound training. Others believed reinforcements had arrived. Few imagined it originated from one commander's simple demonstration on a steel deck. Surrounded by the salty air of the Pacific and the distant hum of maintenance crews working on aircraft marked with the scars of previous battles, toward the edge of the chaotic sky, another group of Zeros joined the fray. Their arrival turned the air into a crowded arena of twisting metal. The Wildcats began to descend slightly to maintain energy, their engines roaring under strain, the formation tightening and stretching in small adjustments that mirrored the pressure of survival. The ocean glimmered beneath them, a vast and different witness. The Japanese pilots attempted to adapt. They shifted from individual attacks to coordinated dives, hoping to break the formation through synchronized aggression. Yet even under this pressure, the square held. The burned matchstick's lesson replicated itself through instinct. One pilot felt his aircraft shudder as tracers passed near his wingtip, but he refused to peel off. Another smelled burning oil, yet stayed locked into position. The commander's teaching had replaced panic with structure, transforming 4 isolated aircraft into a single defensive geometry that punished improvisation and rewarded discipline. Slowly, the Japanese realized that this was not the same opponent they had faced in early December. These pilots had learned something that nullified the very foundation of Zero doctrine. They no longer turned with the enemy. They no longer chased. They no longer isolated themselves. They fought within the limits of their machines. But those limits became strength once woven together. And then the moment came that defined the entire ENGEMENTA Zero dove toward the rear Wildcat, attempting a classic vertical slash intended to tear apart the formation's weakest link. But as he descended, 2 Wildcats rotated slightly to face him, creating an overlapping field of fire. The enemy pilot pushed deeper, committed beyond retreat, trusting his aircraft's grace to carry him through. Yet before he could reach firing distance, a pair of coordinated bursts struck his canopy and engine. The Zero erupted into a downward spin, trailing smoke that marked a path toward the sea. The remaining Japanese pilots hesitated. For the first time in weeks, uncertainty entered their formation. The Americans pressed forward, not aggressively, but resolutely. Their square remained intact, though battered and strained. Ammunition was running low. Fuel was dropping. Engines were heating under the relentless demand of maintaining formation under pressure. Yet even now, the burned matchstick still echoed across the sky. A final Zero attempted a lone attack, sweeping in from the side. His maneuver was clever, almost elegant, a spiraling entry designed to create disorientation and confusion. But the formation responded with small, almost imperceptible adjustments that denied him the angle he needed. He fired, missed, overshot, and flew straight into the defensive trap formed by the 2 lead Wildcats. The .50 caliber round struck true. The Zero's wings snapped backward, sending the aircraft tumbling down in a chaotic descent that ended in a burst of seawater and flame dock as the air finally cleared. The Wildcats banged together, still in formation, like 4 wounded but unbroken soldiers marching in step. The ocean stretched around them in an endless blue field. The sky remained scarred with the smoke trails of fallen aircraft, American and Japanese alike. The pilots' bodies shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. But their discipline held until the carrier re-entered view as a dark line on the horizon. The burned matchstick still lay on the commander's desk below deck. The charred wood, so thin it could snap between two fingers, seemed insignificant compared to the savagery that had unfolded in the sky. Yet the pilots who returned that day carried its lesson deeper than any manual or briefing. It had shown them that victory did not always come from superior machines or greater speed. Sometimes it emerged from unity, from calming chaos, from the understanding that strength multiplies when shared. Rather than scattered dot, it was not the last time the tactic would be used. It spread across squadrons, whispered from pilot to pilot, sketched on mess hall tables and maintenance crates. And always, the explanation began the same way, with a single burned matchstick.